Welcome to Ratbags and Roustabouts, the place where we tell those extraordinary stories of ordinary people who never made it to the history books, but who we should really be celebrating all the same. I'm your host, Marion Langford. You know, at school and throughout our lives, we learn about history, but it just focuses on the big players, the kings and queens, the famous and the infamous. But I think some of the most interesting stories from history are found in our own family trees. I really wanted to share and give a voice to some of those stories, which was the inspiration for Ratbags and Roustabouts. So last time we heard about the Basham family, and in particular John Basham, who was tragically killed at just 21 when he found himself caught in the middle of a gunfight between a group of soldiers and a couple of bushrangers in 1820s Van Diemen's Land, which is now, of course, known as Tasmania, the southernmost state in Australia. This episode, we'll be looking at another family's encounter with a bushranger, and this one was much more savage than Matthew Brady, who we heard about last time. This is the story of bushranger Thomas Jeffries, better known as the Monster, and his attack on Elizabeth and John Tibbs and their infant son, John Isaac Tibbs. I did mention in the last episode that there was a link between the Basham family and this story. Previously, I told you the story of John Basham. Today's story has links to his older brother, William. William was married to Louisa Tibbs, whose brother John and his wife and baby today's tale will focus on. William Stockman, whose name is up for debate, but I'll explain that a bit more later, was also sadly involved in a tragic way. I will warn you, and take this as your trigger warning, there are some pretty dark moments in this tale, and I'll be giving all the details. So I do want to warn you that today's story involves the death of a child in quite a gruesome way. Anyway, let's get started and head back to New Year's Eve 1825 on a property which was then just a few kilometres north of the fledgling town of Launceston, a spot which my research suggests was probably around what is now the suburb of Invermay. That day, Elizabeth and John Tibbs, along with their 5-month-old baby, John Isaac Tibbs, were at home on the farm they rented from John's father, having lunch. Elizabeth was just 19 years old, and John was only a few years older. They'd been married about a year and a half, and their baby was still breastfeeding. A bit of background first. While Elizabeth and John were both free settlers, as most people at that time, they had some convict connections. Elizabeth's mother, Anne Carey, had been a convict sent out with the Second Fleet, sentenced to 7 years for stealing 2 handkerchiefs. Yes, you could literally be banished to the other side of the world in those days for something so petty. Elizabeth's father, Theophilus Futrell, was a soldier on the same ship. It was the second marriage for both, and they had at least 9 children together. But by this time, Theophilus was dead, having taken his own life while in England in 1821. Meanwhile, John Tibbs' father and uncle, John and Isaac Tibbs, just to make all the repetition of the names even more confusing, were both convicts. They'd been caught breaking into a house and stealing, among other things, 4 teaspoons and a petticoat. They were sent to Van Diemen's Land, served their sentences, got land grants, and at some point, John's son, also John, followed them out and began helping them as a shepherd on their land. And so from now on, I'll try not to mention John Sr., the convict, and instead from here on out, let's assume John Tibbs is John Jr., husband to Elizabeth. Anyway, let's leave them having lunch and check in on some other people. Thomas Jeffries, along with Edward Russell and John Perry, were on a bit of a crime spree after escaping from Launceston Watch House a few weeks earlier on December 11. Now, these weren't nice guys. On Christmas Day, they had shot a man they'd just happened to come across in the thigh before forcing him to carry all of their knapsacks. When he couldn't, they shot him again and left him to die. Jeffries was the leader of the gang. In the last episode, I talked about his rivalry with another Tassie bushranger, Matthew Brady. Brady had cast Jeffries out of his group due to Jeffries' habit of assaulting and raping women. There's a bit of a tendency to view all convicts who are transported as victims of circumstance. You've got the Industrial Revolution causing widespread poverty, terrible working conditions, and people are having to steal just so they can afford to feed their families. And look, that is true to a large extent, but it doesn't mean that the odd criminal didn't slip through who was truly evil. Jeffries was one such man. He grew up in Bristol, the son of a butcher, and left home to become a sailor as soon as he was able. He joined the man-of-war Achille and possibly took part in the Battle of Trafalgar. After 5 years, he deserted, and then we see a gradual descent into gambling, drinking, and burglary. He began by stealing from his family connections, but eventually ran out of those and so just started robbing anyone. And that's when he was caught and sentenced to transportation. But his actions in these early years do show a man who would double-cross literally anyone if it would benefit himself. I think it's pretty safe to diagnose him as a narcissist and a sociopath. Very dangerous man. He liked to call himself captain, possibly a nod to his naval roots, but he was soon given a different nickname by the people of Van Diemen's Land, the Monster. Because he enjoyed punishing others, at first Jeffries did well, being made an overseer and a flagellator to keep the other convicts in line. He later said drink was his downfall, and this probably did play a part, but assigning blame anywhere but at their own feet is classic narcissistic behaviour. In his confession, which he wrote in the days before his execution, he said of this period, "I was sent for Launceston, where drink was the total ruin of me. I was made watch-house keeper, a situation unfit for a drunkard. I tried to leave it long before, but could not. It was to my ruin." While he was in charge of the watch-house, on at least 2 occasions he used his position to sexually assault women. One, a Mrs. Jessup, was tricked into going there, then locked by Jeffries in a cell where he tried to force alcohol on her and told her he wouldn't let her go unless she slept with him. Another time he was charged with taking a female prisoner out of the watch-house. It's unclear if this was against her will, though with his reputation, I'd say it's likely. For that, he was fined. A report in the Colonial Times from February 10, 1826 said, "The treatment of many women who had been placed under his charge in the watch-house is monstrous beyond description." Eventually, his increasingly violent behaviour saw Jeffries locked up in the same watch-house he had previously been in charge of. It was then that he led the jailbreak, which saw him passing by the Tibbs farm on that December 31st. Jeffries, Russell and Perry had already come across 2 men who worked for Charles Bernard, who owned a large tract of land adjacent to the Tibbs farm. They had forced these men to come with them, though it's unclear the purpose of this. It's possibly it was simply just to carry their gear. Now they came across another convict who worked for Tibbs, one Samuel Russell. Yes, I know, it's another name duplicate just to make things confusing yet again. So we'll keep to his first name, I think. Samuel later told police he recognised Jeffries. He called him Thomas Jeffries the Flogger in his statement. He said Jeffries had a musket and a pistol, and the other 2 outlaws each had a gun. Bernard's men were unarmed and carrying knapsacks, possibly belonging to the bushrangers. Samuel was holding an axe. The men told him to drop it, and Jeffries bound his wrists with the end of a whip, then drove him towards the Tibbs house. As they neared it, the dogs started barking, and so Jeffries made Samuel call out to his master. Out came John Tibbs and his wife Elizabeth, who was holding their baby son in her arms. And this is the moment. When Elizabeth and Jeffries lock eyes, in that moment, Elizabeth's life is ruined, and she will never be the same again. Jeffries, dressed in a long black coat, red waistcoat and kangaroo skin cap, ordered one of the other bushrangers to take the family, as well as one of Bernard's men, who was probably George Mogg, into the bush. Then Jeffries, the other bushranger, Samuel and Bernard's other man called Walker went into the house. Jeffries pointed to things as Samuel and Walker were ordered to collect them. In Samuel's own words, in his statement about the events of that day, he ordered me to pack up such things as he pointed out. He collected a jacket, a pair of trousers, 2 or 3 shirts, some butter, some soap, a bottle of wine, a pack of cards, a quantity of dough, a little pepper which was in a piece of paper, and about 8 or 10 pounds of sugar. He ordered the whole of those articles to be put into one of my master's bags and compelled Mr. Bernard's man to carry them and made me carry a knapsack. They then joined the others and began walking north, keeping a distance from the road so as not to be spotted. They were now on Bernard's land and came across one of his men, William Franklin, who they also made their prisoner. Soon after, they saw the stockkeeper of William Basham. Now, we heard a bit about the Basham family in our previous episode, and as I said earlier, William Basham was married to Tibbs' sister. And I'm very sorry to say this, but his stockkeeper, the man Jeffries, Perry and Russell now confronted, was a man named John Isaac. Okay, I just have to interrupt the story here to say, I know. The name of the stockman seems incredible and unlikely. John Tibbs later wrote his own account of this day, and in it he names the stockman as Isaac. Samuel Russell also names him as Isaac, and I have the death register naming him as John Isaac, a prisoner aged 36. However, though there were several convicts by that name, none of them can be this man. Was he not a convict, but he was named as a prisoner in the death register? Was he just called that, but his real name was something else? Was his name a massive coincidence? Or in the aftermath of this, were they all just protecting his identity? Honestly, if anyone out there has any light to shed on this particular mystery, I would love to hear it. Anyway, back to the story. One of the bushrangers orders Isaac to stand. He refuses. The bushranger cocks his gun and says if he doesn't, he'll blow his brains out. This time, Isaac obeys. So we now have quite a large group. There are the 3 bushrangers, Jeffries, Russell and Perry. Then there's the Tibbs family, John and Elizabeth carrying their 5-month-old baby. There is Tibbs' servant, Samuel. There's Basham's stockman, Isaac. And there are the 3 of Bernard's men, Walker, Franklin and Mogg. That's 11 people trudging through the Tasmanian bush in the middle of summer. Why does Jeffries continue to collect prisoners? Yes, the 3 bushrangers are fairly well armed, but some of these prisoners are young, physically fit, big, strong men. And some of them were convicts. They would have had a fair amount of violence in their past. Every time they take another prisoner, they're increasing the possibility of revolt. Is Jeffries just so lazy he doesn't want to carry his own bag? I think it's more than this. He's a sociopath, a serial killer, a rapist. He's also a cannibal. He has no problem eating human flesh if it serves his own purpose. This is a man without morals. He hasn't met a line he wouldn't cross. He's called the monster, but he refers to himself as the captain. He wants everyone to know he's in charge. He loves being dominant over others. He gets off on the power trip, and he's a dangerous, violent man. And before the day is out, he will demonstrate that in the most horrific way. It's possible the idea that the prisoners might try something actually did occur to Jeffries, because after they'd travelled about 5 kilometres, he ordered them to stop and pulled out the 2 strongest men of the group. Those 2 men were Tibbs and Isaac. Russell and Perry then took them, Elizabeth and the baby, and possibly one of Bernard's men away from the rest of the group. Later, John Tibbs wrote his own account of that day. This is what he said about what happened at this point. We were tied up and ordered to proceed to the side of a steep hill, which I refused unless my wife and child was permitted to accompany me. Upon arrival at the said hill, where after resting about 15 minutes, the bushrangers said it was time to make a move and demanded our names. I answered Isaac and John. Then Isaac and John was ordered to go on their knees and pray, as they had only a few minutes to live. I reasoned with Perry, but without effect. My partner Isaac went on his knees when they shot him in the head. I did not go on my knees, although I was saying my prayer at the same time, expecting the same fate as my partner, and my poor wife and child in her arms by my side, in a state better to be conceived than described. Perry then discharged his piece at me, the contents of which lodged in my neck, where part still remains. I then made my escape by throwing myself down the hill, in which I received several severe fractures. Perry came up to me again and struck me several times with the butt end of his musket. I then made my escape. Perry, in his confession, gave his own account of the shooting of Isaac and Tibbs. When we had got about 2 miles from Tibbs' house, Russell and I took Tibbs, the stockkeeper, and Mrs. Tibbs and her child from the rest of the party, after one of Mr. Bernard's men had tied the hands of Tibbs and the stockkeeper. When they had gone with us about 1/4 mile, Russell ordered Tibbs and the stockkeeper to say their prayers. The stockkeeper knelt down. Russell shot him with a pistol. I fired at Tibbs with a musket which I had loaded that morning with gunpowder and 7 pistol balls. He ran away. I ran after him and knocked him down with my musket. His hands then got loose, which had been tied with my black silk handkerchief, and he ran away. I picked up my handkerchief and soon afterwards rejoined Russell and Mrs. Tibbs near the body of the man that Russell had shot. Poor John Isaac was dead, shot in the head by Russell. Meanwhile, Tibbs had been shot in the neck, thrown himself down a hill, had broken bones, and now had to run away from his wife and child to try to get help. But he had escaped. There was hope. Meanwhile, we have poor Elizabeth. She had just watched a man killed in front of her. She's watched her own husband's attempted execution, seen him escape, and she is left in this terrifying situation, alone with her baby still in her arms. And she's so young, she's still a teenager herself. She's scared witless, being marched at gunpoint through the untamed bush, and all she's thinking about is protecting her baby. I don't know if you've carried a baby for any length of time, but they get very heavy very quickly. A 5-month-old boy averages about 7.5 kilos. At this point, Elizabeth has already carried him 5 kilometres, and she has who knows how many more ahead of her. But not even Elizabeth, in her worst nightmares, could dream up what would happen next. The group now consisted of the 3 bushrangers, Walker and Franklin, who were Bernard's men, Tibbs Stockman Samuel, and Elizabeth and the baby. We have somehow lost the other man of Bernard's, who I mentioned before was probably George Mogg. It's possible he escaped at some point when the bushrangers were chasing after Tibbs. They continued to march north through the bush, but the baby began fussing. He was hungry, heavy. He was slowing them down. In Jeffries' confession, which he wrote in prison before his execution, he said, "We could not get the woman on. We did not know what to do." Jeffries stopped the group and demanded that Elizabeth hand the baby to him. She refused. Jeffries grabbed the child regardless, and he and Russell took the baby off into the bush, leaving the distraught mother with the rest of the group. This is how Samuel described it. "I saw Jeffries, the other bushranger, my mistress and child coming towards us. Jeffries was carrying the child. My mistress was crying. Jeffries desired us to hurry on, and he and another of the bushrangers separated from us, taking the child with them. My mistress had begged Jeffries not to take her child from her. He said she could not carry it. She said she would carry it as long as she could walk, and when he was gone, she said, "The villain is going to murder my child." About half an hour later, the pair returned without the baby. Elizabeth cried, accusing them of murdering her child. Jeffries denied it. He said he'd sent it off with one of Bernard's men and she would be reunited with her son soon. But that was a lie. Elizabeth was right. Jeffries had murdered her child. He had bashed the infant's brains out against a rock and left his poor little body in the bush. About a week later, it was recovered. In the interim, his limbs had been eaten by wild animals. When later he was asked why he had killed the baby, Jeffries' answer was that he looked upon every human being as his personal enemy, according to a newspaper article. It's frankly a pathetic justification. It is extreme paranoia that a 5-month-old could pose such a threat. Or is it a weak attempt to again somehow show himself to be powerful while also being unfairly persecuted? In his confession, he didn't mention the murder of the baby directly. He happily talked about other murders, even cannibalism, but the closest he got to talking about the child was this line, "I can tell no more of that. The great God, I hope, will forgive the 3 of us." It was little consolation for Elizabeth and John Tibbs. And the day was still not over. Elizabeth, suspecting her child had been murdered, was still a prisoner, and the group continued through the bush, walking 15 kilometres in total before they were allowed to rest for the night. They set up camp with the bushrangers taking turns to keep watch through the night. A bed was made away from the others, and this, Jeffries said, was for himself and Elizabeth. Samuel later said, "We then all laid down round the fire. By Jeffries' orders, one of the bushrangers kept watch. Jeffries made a bed about 6 yards from the fire, beyond our heads, with a blanket and a kangaroo rug over it, in which he obliged Mrs. Tibbs to lay on the opposite side from us with him. I heard no conversation pass between them. I did not hear her cry out during the night. I heard her fretting once during the night. She was crying." It's probable Jeffries raped Elizabeth that night. The next morning he let her and Walker go. Through the course of the afternoon, he let the other men go as well. The 3 bushrangers then continued on their way. Before they were caught, they managed to traverse a large circle which took in most of the area east of Launceston to the northeast coast of Tasmania and back. During that time, when they were close to Georgetown, they killed a constable called Magnus Bakey. They had met him on the road and made him carry their bags. Then, as he walked in front, Jeffries suddenly, and for no reason at all, shot him in the back of the head. He was killed instantly. Sometime later, with the 3 outlaws starving and in a pretty desperate situation, they made a pact that the first one to fall asleep would be killed by the others and eaten. That unfortunate man turned out to be Edward Russell. In Perry's confession, he spoke of this very matter-of-factly. "We did not know the way to any inhabited part of the island at this time, and were 2 or 3 days without food of any kind when Jeffries shot a cockatoo, which was equally divided between us. 3 or 4 days after, when we were much exhausted for want of food, Jeffries said to me and Russell, 'If you like, the first man that falls asleep shall be shot and become food for the other 2. Russell and I said, 'We bought it, we're glad of it.' 2 days after, we were going up a rocky and scrubby high hill when we all sat down to rest ourselves about 11 o'clock in the day. Russell fell asleep. I was sitting close to him. I took a pistol from my knapsack, which was loaded with 3 balls, and shot Russell in the forehead. He expired without a groan. I took out my knife and cut off about 7 or 8 pounds of flesh from the thick part of his thighs. I made a fire and broiled some of it on the fire, and Jeffries and I ate about 1 pound of it. I put the rest into my knapsack." Sometime after that, Perry went out in search of water one night and got lost in the bush. He never found his way back to Jeffries and instead continued on alone until he was captured. Jeffries equally came unstuck on January 22 when he was recognised by a boy as he headed towards a hut in the South Esk region near Launceston. The boy ran back unseen to the large group of men he was with, who concealed themselves until Jeffries was within reach of a musket ball, according to the write-up in the Hobart Town Gazette. As they were about to fire, Jeffries asked if there was any quarter, any chance for mercy. They agreed and he surrendered to them. When news spread of Jeffries' apprehension, a ripple of hatred ran through the inhabitants of Launceston. Elizabeth's mother, Anne Futrell, was particularly angry at the vicious murder of her grandson. She was in her home when she heard someone call out that Jeffries was here. She ran out of the house, brandishing a fork in her hand, screaming for blood. "Which is he who has murdered my child?" she screamed. "I will have blood from someone." She then stuck the fork into the man's thigh. Unfortunately, it wasn't Jeffries. It was just a constable who it seems wasn't too pleased to be skewered in the leg with a fork. An account of Jeffries being brought to Launceston jail, given by John Batman, was published in the Hobart Town Gazette. The monster arrived in Launceston a few minutes before 9 o'clock on Sunday evening. The town was almost emptied of its inhabitants to meet the inhuman wretch. Several attempts were made by the people to take him out of the cart that they might wreak their vengeance upon him, and it became necessary to send into town for a stronger guard to prevent his immediate dispatch. He entered the town and jail amidst the curses of every person whomsoever. This morning I had the opportunity of seeing him, and a more awful spectacle you cannot conceive. He appeared very anxious to die. Jeffries and Perry's trial was incredibly emotional for everyone. All the bushrangers' prisoners from that day who survived appeared as witnesses. But it was Elizabeth's appearance that made the most impact. When she first came into the courtroom and saw the man who had murdered her child and the man who had shot and almost killed her husband, she was so affected as to be unable to stand, according to the Hobart Town Gazette. It went on. The bare recital of the dreadful journey which the monster had compelled her to take with him in the woods was a painful addition to her sufferings. When it was necessary for her to look at the prisoners in order to prove their persons, the suddenness with which she withdrew her eyes and the tears with which the effort was accompanied was an instance of detestation more strongly depicted than any assembly of spectators perhaps ever witnessed. During the trial, Elizabeth said that when she had asked Jeffries to tell her where she might find the baby's body so she could later retrieve and bury him, he told her it was no odds the baby had not suffered a moment's pain in leaving the world, and the bushrangers had inferred to her that the life of a child was regarded as nothing. The trial lasted until 11 p.m. and both Jeffries and Perry were found guilty and sentenced to death. And so, on May 4, 1826, Thomas Jeffries, standing with his old nemesis, the bushranger Matthew Brady, much to Brady's disgust, was hanged. He blamed all his crimes on alcohol. Justice was served, but what happened to everyone else? It seems it was a family cursed with tragedy. Elizabeth's mother, Anne, who had stuck the fork into the unfortunate constable, died in 1830, the same year that her 17-year-old son, Thomas, who had been living with the Tibbses since the Jeffries incident, also died. John and Elizabeth Tibbs had another child the year after Jeffries was hanged in 1827, a girl named Susanna. But the year after that, aged just 21, Elizabeth Tibbs died. No cause of death is given on the register from that time, so all we can do is guess what killed her at such a young age. This tragic figure who endured so much, who showed such strength in trying to protect her son, in standing up to her aggressors, who then faced them again in court. Did she just get sick? Did she have an accident? Did she take her life as her father had done years before? We will never know. But of all the people who went up against the monster Thomas Jeffries throughout his notorious and murderous career, she was the only one to beat him, facing him in court that day and sealing his fate with no more than a look. It's been a long and harrowing episode, but next time we will lighten things up a bit as we look at the life of Dickie White. Dickie is the kind of person you read about and wish you could have met. He was a highwayman, a publican, an eccentric, and a fiddle player. And while things began badly for him, he managed to turn it all around while also falling hopelessly in love along the way. So join me next time for some romance and highway robbery on Ratbags and Roustabouts. I hope you've enjoyed today's episode. I'm Marion Langford, and make sure you join me again for more stories about those common as muck ratbags and roustabouts from our past who still have extraordinary tales to tell.